Hello, my name is David Wolfe. I work as an environmental lawyer, and I'm also lucky enough to manage a small organic agroforestry farm in Suffolk, one of the oldest and most established in Europe, and this is my provocation about farming for the future. The simple starting point is that perhaps most farming is a major contributor to the nature crisis and a major contributor to the climate crisis, and ironically also now starting to suffer from climate change itself. So we have that central paradox in farming. All farming, and this is my basic proposition, all farming has to become part of the solution to those crises, not part of the problem. And my wider call for action is that requires action and intervention by a wide range of organisations, not just government, other organisations too, and not just subsidies and enforcement, although it requires those things as part of the mix. The starting point is we have to be honest and say that the kind of farming that's been taking place for the last 80 years is not traditional farming. It's the product of the Agriculture Act of 1947, which goaled farming on two things, food production and farm incomes, completely at the expense of the environment. And if you bear in mind that most farmers are over 60, this is just one generation ago. Oops. Look at incomes for farmers. Has that actually worked? Has farm income actually worked to help farmers? This is DEFRA figures. Last year, DEFRA's figure for cereal farms, which is what I am in East Anglia, the average farmer income was just £40,000. Just £40,000. Not rich. Where does that come from? Look at the breakdown. Top graph there. They lost money on their farming. They lost £26,000 a year on their farming. That was more or less offset by subsidies, but their actual income, the cereal farmers, came from non-agricultural activities, diversification. They might look down the chart then and say, where's the money? The money's in specialist poultry, intensive poultry units. Sadly, that has led to a dash towards intensive poultry units. That's Herefordshire, Shropshire and Powys. Look at all those poultry units. The problem is that they produce huge amounts of chicken shit, which has to go somewhere, and the history has been of a low-grade use of that excessively on farming, spreading it in a way which has polluted our rivers, as we've seen. That has to stop. It's not a new problem. Even in 2002, English Nature was saying this is a problem. Severe nutrient problem, 43% action needed to be taken. That was 2002. The EU required intervention. What did the EU require? Legislation, and that was introduced by the UK, the farming rules for water, preventing excess spreading of nutrients on land. Farmers pushed back, saying that was draconian and punitive. I worry that farming is risking its social licence by this kind of reaction. What did the government do? It fundamentally undermined that legislation by introducing guidance which allowed for autumn muck spreading. That was a big problem. So legislation good, guidance bad. That's not how we should be doing this. Government needs to be on message. Fortunately, River Action took a legal case, challenged that, went to court. Unfortunately, the NFU took what I thought was an unexpected reaction to actually say that the law was unworkable. That was really unfortunate. Fortunately, the judge saw through that and said farming practices have to change. That's the kind of coherence that we need. New government, fortunately, has adopted that and has now said that manure has to be spread at the right time of application. But we have to not go through that kind of process again. We have to stick with the law and make the law work. We need to enforce the law properly and effectively. That is beginning to happen with some of these IPUs. Some local authorities are now starting to call time on the excess IPUs, or at least on asking them what they're going to do with this excess manure. Some local authorities are starting to act. Local authorities are part of the picture on farming and the environment. Unfortunately, National England and the Environment Agency are not doing their bit. They have a moratorium on house building around excess nutrients, but no equivalent on the farming side of it. Those little 1% thresholds are adding up to allow a cumulative impact which is destroying our rivers. We have to take a coherent approach on both sides of that equation. The problem really seen this year, Lough Neagh, Northern Ireland, this is not just about England, Lough Neagh is in an absolutely terrible state. That's from the other week. But what are the courts doing about it? What are the courts doing about it? Farmer who polluted Lough Neagh fined £200. That's not going to change behaviours. That's not going to change behaviours. Government action is also woefully lacking. Fish Legal and other environmental NGOs took legal action to require diffuse water pollution plans for 37 protected areas. We still only have 5 protected areas with diffuse water pollution plans. Government action across the piece needs to be taken. As I said, central paradox in all of this is that farmers are themselves now the victim of climate change issues. This year, drought, dairy farmers being affected by climate change. So farming not just the cause of the problem, but also now a victim of it. Unfortunately, the reaction from that has been unfortunate. What happened was that the starting point was Henry Dimbleby's food strategy, and then the Committee on Climate Change said we need to have less dairy and less meat and more trees in fields, agroforestry. I'll come back to that in a second. Sadly, the farming industry pressed back and said, we shouldn't be doing that. And this is exactly the kind of unnuanced response that I think is going to cause problems if it carries on. What we need is a mature approach to meat and dairy. What we need is some nuance. Other side of the government agencies, the AHDB, not talked about much in the public domain, but all appointed by DEFRA. What's the AHDB doing? Promoting more meat eating and making unsustainable environmental claims. That shouldn't be happening. What the AHDB should be doing is supporting farmers to transition to other crops and not encouraging the very meat production which we know is causing the climate change problem in the first place. Those are sheep in my fields. I've done the maths. Because they're part of my farming system, they are an environmentally friendly, climate change friendly product. What we need is nuance in that debate. We need to recognise that some farming is very bad, some meat farming, is very bad for the environment. Likewise, some dairy farming is very bad for the environment, but not all of it. We need to have a nuanced approach that promotes the good side of those industries and discourages the bad side of them. We also need to grow other crops. I bet most of you in this room have got lentils in your cupboard, almost certainly grown in India and Canada. Why are they not being grown in the UK? British lentils. Those are, top right-hand corner, those are lentils growing in my fields in Suffolk. You can grow lentils in the UK, but it needs government support and industry support to encourage farmers to make that positive transition. There are clear examples of how government is intervening to support particular crops, which is what I'm talking about. Support particular beneficial crops. For example, around neonicotinoids. Neonicotinoids were being allowed to support farmer livelihoods in the sugar beet sector. Farmer livelihoods in the sugar beet sector. There needs to be a creative approach to the kind of levers we use to encourage a shift away from the unsustainable crops and the unsustainable practices into the sustainable ones. Support farmers in their financially insecure position to make that transition. Fortunately, this government reversed the neonicotinoids ban. One of the big things that the previous government, and I hope again this government is doing in this kind of area, and this brings me on to subsidies, is to encourage agroforestry. We need trees in our fields to sequester carbon to tackle climate change. 10% target in our current CBDP policy. How is that going to be done? By subsidies, or how was it going to be done? By subsidies. Quick word on subsidies. You look at that figure down the bottom there, £233, that's what's called the basic payment. That's what every farmer used to get, regardless of what they did. Flat rate, £233 a hectare. As it happens, that's now dropped to 50% of that level, and it's going to drop to zero. So that basic flat rate payment is going out of the system, and instead, the previous government said we would get £849 a hectare for agroforestry. That's a big incentive to people to change. That's my farm. We would get £849 a hectare. My neighbour would get nothing. That's a big incentive for him to change his farming practices. Sadly, the SFI was halted. We need the SFI to be properly reinstated and properly funded to support that transition. But we need to be careful. This was a report from last week where the Wildlife Trust had called out farming practices who were ploughing too close to ditches, which is in effect a crime. Sadly, DEFRA's response was to say, well, we're going to put subsidies in to discourage that. We shouldn't be subsidising not breaking the law. We should be enforcing against not breaking the law and subsidising the positive changes. So let's bring back the subsidies properly, but to support positive change. A completely different crop. So these buildings here are made of hemp. Where is that hemp grown? It's grown in France. Hemp is a fantastic crop. It sequesters carbon 5 times as fast as trees when it's growing. But we basically don't grow it in this country now. Not that we can't. That's hemp growing in my fields shown 2 weeks ago. It grows very well here. Historically, we've grown a lot of hemp in this country. Why do farmers not grow hemp? Well, first reason is you need a licence from the Home Office. You have to have a criminal records check. You have to pay £580 to have a licence. That's a big disincentive to go into it. Absolutely bonkers, right? And also, the machinery that's needed to process it, the big machinery, costs £6 million for a unit. Actually, not very much money at all. But there is only one of those machines in this country. The French government invested in a whole range of those in the same way as historically our government invested in sugar plants, sugar manufacturing plants like the one at Bury St Edmunds. We need the government not just to put money into subsidies, but to invest in that kind of machinery, which will encourage UK farmers to grow hemp. Fantastic crop. That's Sheringham. Why is this interesting? Because when there was a crisis in the Navy, and the Navy needed rope, and it needed hemp, Parliament legislated to require farmers in Norfolk and Suffolk to grow hemp. 1 acre of hemp for every 60 acres of land they had. There were fines for not doing that. Collecting the fines, therefore enforcing, was given to a private individual who was told, you can take the money for this and you can build a pier at Sheringham using the money. Interestingly, the farmers overwhelmingly complied, so the guy didn't collect very much money. And that's why there's no pier at Sheringham. If you want serious intervention, if you have a crisis in your navy and you need rope, or you have a crisis in your environment and you need action, you can take very serious measures, and it works. That's what you might call better regulation. If you don't want to be quite so aggressive about it, there are other techniques available. I'll come back to that in a moment. We also need consumer action. Consumers need to use their purchasing power in an informed way, but that requires proper action to ensure that schemes that claim compliance with environmental standards are properly policed. That's not the position at the moment. We don't need misleading consumer advertising. Just a very small point. At the moment, if you look at those figures there, people might know about permitted development, things you can do without planning permission. Last year, the permitted development regime was changed so that farmers can turn barns into all sorts of things, and the number there was increased from 500 to 1,000 square metres. That means I could turn my barns into a 25-bedroom hotel, effectively with no environmental scrutiny. That cannot be right. That cannot be right. I'm nearly there. We also need fiscal measures. Here's a really good unintended consequence. Whatever you think about the family farm tax, as they called it, wrongly called it, but the IHT, there is a massive silver lining to that in terms of changing farming practices, because it is encouraging succession planning. It's bringing into farming a whole range of younger farmers instead of the 70 to 80-year-old farmers who are more progressive in their ideas. Not me saying it exclusively. Here's somebody in the industry saying it. That is going to shift the way farming works, of an unintended consequence of all of that. It's the kind of thing we need to think about. There are lots of fiscal measures that could be taken to encourage a beneficial shift in farming practices that are not happening at the moment. I also have a question about whether DEFRA, in its current form, is really fit for practice. Can the same organisation that has to keep that river clean also try and keep your chicken cheap on the Tesco shelves? I don't know. Anyway, my proposition is very simple. There are a whole range of actors that need to act, and a whole load of levers that need to be pulled, if that's what you do. And we all need to do that together, because let's together make farming part of the solution, not part of the cause of the problem. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, David, for that very simple proposition. A lot for the panel to get their teeth into there, I think. It's not on the screen, so I'll just briefly introduce us. I'm Zoe Davis. I manage the West of England Nature Partnership, and I'm joined by Brendan Costello, who's Director of Policy and Strategy at the Soil Association, Vicky Hurd, Strategic Lead on Agriculture at the Wildlife Trusts, Andrew Clark, Director of Policy at the National Farmers Union, and Martin Lyons, Chief Executive of the Nature Friendly Farming Network. So I'm just going to go down the line, and I'll start with you, Martin. If you could just respond to some of those very rich themes that David started us off on there.
Cool, lovely, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Subsidies, we haven't got subsidies anymore. It's public money for public goods. What does the public want, or government want us to deliver as farmers? I'm a farmer in Cambridgeshire, so it's clearly using that money to deliver the outcomes we want. Hemp, trees, we heard the minister this morning saying we're going to use more trees to grow the infrastructure, the schools, the buildings. In 20, 30, 40 years' time, let's have hemp. I haven't thought about that. That's a huge opportunity of really driving growth and carbon capture through our farming system that gives us opportunities. Farmers are running their businesses. We've got to work that out. Yes, have more pulses, great opportunity. Let's get the SFI right that delivers the right outcome. And you started off saying farmers is causing the problems, not all farmers. And we need to really distinguish what is good and bad, but not chastise the bad. How do we help them improve, and what levers do they need to shift? That might be finance, regulation, I think. We do actually shift to a better system. And we are the solutions to the future. For food, for nature, for climate, for everything we want is from our 70% of land that is managed by farming.
Thank you. Andrew.
Okay, thanks, Zoe. And first of all, I'd just like to welcome this conference and the fact that you've actually got farmers and environmentalists talking to each other. I think that's really critical for the future. And I'd start off with where David finished, which is farming's got to be part of the solution. Farmers and members of the NFU and all the other organisations that represent farmers manage 75% of the land surface of the UK. And without making sure that they are helping them to achieve the outcomes that are wanted, then you can kiss bye-bye to 30 by 30 environmental improvement plans. We've got to be part of the solution. I think that, David, when I listened to you, and there's a rich theme in everything you said. I think the one thing I start with is there is a huge crisis of confidence amongst farmers at the present moment. A crisis in terms of what our role is, and also the financial security of the future. We in the NFU have been tracking farming confidence, both short-term and longer-term, since 2010. And in the last 2 years, we've had to put new lines on the bottom of the chart to go and track confidence. And without confidence, you're not going to get investment, you're not going to get change. And so many of the things you talk about, and I thought it was really good, you writing all the different, the solution's simple, but when you look at all the different organisations involved in that solution, and including DEFRA, the solution's not simple. If it was, we would have got it, and we really need to get a solution. Some of that solution, yes, it's got to be better regulation. And we can have a discussion now or later about farming rules for water, nutrient neutrality, because I think there are ways through that. And it might appear the NFU was objecting, but actually there are good reasons why we did it. And because we want to ensure that farming can decarbonise and be more reliant on organic manures rather than fossil-based manures and fertilisers. At the present moment, farming rules for water doesn't allow that. It actually pushes farmers in the other direction because of the worry they have with regulation. I thought it was two really important things you talked about. Important to differentiating between UK, it's a nuanced argument, between UK production and the rest of the world. There are real reasons why we should be looking to the UK to be more of our domestic food production and consumption come from the UK and northwestern Europe rather than the rest of the world. But it's not to say that every British farm is brilliant. There's got to be some thinking through in terms of that, and the trade standards are going to be critical in terms of that. And the last point I wanted to make was about the importance of financial security, because if farmers aren't financially secure, again, that adds to the lack of confidence. The fact that we're now on SFI, going to have the fourth version of the SFI in 4 years, stop-start public goods for public payment for public goods is not the way forward, and we've got to have solutions that are scalable.
Thanks, Andrew. Vicky.
Yes, I thought it was a great provocation from you, David. Very good. I mean, these are big challenges, and we're in a place of people who really care about that. So we want to be clear that we've got big challenges, and I absolutely agree with people saying farmers are part of the solution. But the Wildlife Trust is very clear. We do need to have strong regulation to protect and nurture the nature that underpins our whole system of survival in this country. So it's absolutely essential that we get that right. And we've done a vision for farming. We released it during the last couple of months, which says that in 25 years, all farming should be agroecological or in transition to agroecological. And that means that they need to be diverse. You were talking about diversity, doing more different crops like hemp, like agroforestry, greater rotations, because that builds in the resilience, the climate resilience, but it also builds in a new diet, which, as we well know, the nation's diet needs to change. And that's one of the things we talk about in our vision, as well as the government providing the kind of support, absolutely agree with Andrew, that's needed to deliver the public goods that farming can and should deliver. And many farmers are already doing that, and they should be supported to continue. And all farmers should get on the ladder of that. And have the training, advice, demonstration that's absolutely essential, because it's not there at the moment, particularly in England. But our vision is clear that it's beyond the farm gate. It's the buyers who squeeze farmers, and have done for a very long time, the extractive supply chain, and which delivers us a diet which is 54% ultra-processed foods, all part of the picture of delivering unsustainable farm practices, which David outlined, and monocultures, water pollution, sediment, soil sediment is one of the biggest problems for our rivers. We have a river campaign, and we talked about buffers and riparian strips around rivers to protect them. One of the biggest problems is the soil getting into our rivers and stifling and smothering the wonderful wildlife that should be growing there, and the wildlife that provides pest predators for farmers, and all sorts of wonderful things, that do things for us that we can't do for ourselves. In addition to pollination, it's the nutrient recycling, those kind of things that our rivers are absolutely essential for. But we are continuing to not face the fact that the continuing investment in really cheap meat protein is completely unsustainable. Our recent report that we did on pig and poultry sector shows the concentration and numbers are just totally unsupportable going forward. If we're going to use our land for the right kind of production, extensive, good production of good meat and crops and more diverse crops, we can't do it if we continue to use 54% of our cropland to feed animals, feed pigs and poultry in very intensive systems. It's just not sustainable. So we've got to move away from that, and that means moving away from that in the supply chain and driving that direction in the right way, and having fair dealing regulations, so that the supply chain is dealing fairly with all farmers so they can actually transition. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Vicky. Bringing in even more rich seams. Brendan.
Yeah, good stuff, and top marks for provocation. Good to see that we all agree on the regulatory point. We need to scale up agroecology, and at the moment there isn't a level playing field. In terms of that regulation, I'd focus on a couple of areas. The livestock question. You talked a bit about intensive poultry units and the horrors of those intensive poultry units, where you've got huge numbers of chickens crammed into really tight spaces in horrible conditions, being fed loads of food that comes from really biodiverse parts of the world, sitting in their own feces that's created such large volumes that you can't possibly sustainably manage it, that's then ending up in our water. Brilliant to see that the planning system is beginning to say no to new intensive poultry units, but all that does is stop the problem getting worse. It doesn't deal with the existing problem. We need a fit-for-purpose permitting system that can deal with all the problems that the livestock sector has, or the intensive livestock sector, so we can start over time phasing out some of those intensive poultry units and other intensive livestock production. Then the other big elephant in the room with regards to regulation are big agri-food businesses. So yes, farmers need to be regulated better, but they're quite a small cog in the food system. They're a small cog being turned by much bigger cogs that are hardly regulated at all. There's been a lot of talk today about BNG. And rightfully so, SME house builders are required to deliver 10% BNG. Those are SME house builders that don't necessarily make a lot of money, and they work in a really volatile sector. How is it right, and it is right, that they have to do that, but our supermarkets are not required to do anything at all to internalise their externalities? That has to change. And if we change that, that really would shift the dial. And then just in terms of crops, yes, we should be doing more to incentivise the right kind of food production in this country. A lot of NGOs came together to produce a horticulture report to discuss what needs to happen to scale that up. What about a pulse report? That would be very helpful indeed. And we also need to stop people planting the wrong crops in the wrong places. So,
Excuse me, could we just
We've got music.
deal with...
I didn't start beatboxing. I am quite good at beatboxing, but that
Thank
wasn't
you.
me.
We're not about to pump up the jam, don't worry.
That's later. Yeah, so we also shouldn't be planting the wrong crops in the wrong places. If you can't grow sugar beet in this country without using neonicotinoids, don't grow sugar beet in this country. And if you're planting maize in fields that flood every winter, and you know they flood every winter, that has to be stopped. That's not beyond the wit of the government to say you can't plant those kind of crops in those kind of places.
Great. Okay, thanks everyone. So we're going to move on to audience questions now, and please do put your questions into the Menti, and they will appear for me here. We've got loads of great ones already, so I'm going to start with, we've talked about intensive livestock farming quite a lot already, and we've got a question about animal welfare, so I'm going to start with that. because I know it's very important to a lot of Wildlife and Countryside Link members as well. So how does the panel think that farmers can plan to uphold better animal welfare standards? Who wants to take that first? Yeah.
Can I just start off? Because there's... yeah, I mean, we were told very clearly by the food chain, all supermarkets, that we should, poultry farmers in the UK have got to supply to better chicken commitment, which means a very significant reduction in terms of the... you probably still wouldn't like the stocking density, but it's very significantly lower than what's in Europe, and certainly much lower and slower growing than what we find in the United States and Thailand and other parts of the world. And a lot of farmers, that means that we have to construct new sheds, because we've got to spread, if they're going to be free range, you've got to have more space to produce, to supply, to meet supply contracts. Supermarkets in the last year, with the prices that are currently having inflation, have reneged on those contracts. So farms that have spent hundreds of millions of pounds, or still waiting to put that investment in, those contracts being walked away from. And this is some part of the problem we've got, and it's why I think Vicky's absolutely right to talk about fair dealing. We need fair dealing, we need certainty, because if you're going to go and move to a completely new a new planting regime, or a new cropping regime, or a new animal welfare regime, you need to have the investment and the certainty to be able to deliver that. You can't have people walking away after 3 or 4 years. It's not an industrial process.
Thanks, Andrew. David?
I was going to say, whatever one thinks about the stocking levels and so on in this country at the moment, what we have to be very fearful of is allowing in, as you say, from Thailand or America. So we have to absolutely make sure the government doesn't allow in, as part of some wider trade deal to support the steel industry or something, sacrifice our good or bad chicken industry for the American chicken industry, because that would be absolutely disastrous. And there's a whole range of other things similarly.
Yeah.
Yeah, or Nigel Farage even more so. But even the current government, I think it's a real risk.
Brendan, then Vicky.
Yeah, so I think there's a big issue as well in terms of carbon tunnel vision and implications for animal welfare. So lots of businesses, very well-meaning businesses, have a real focus on carbon at the moment. And if you just focus on carbon at the moment, that can lead you to quite intensive livestock production, where you keep animals indoors really quickly, you feed them up really quickly, and you basically kill them really quickly. That's not good for welfare. So what we need to avoid that is that all the actors across the supply chain, and government, in fact, are using a breadth of indicators that includes welfare. And that means that you don't get those kind of trade-offs. So your indicators include air, water, carbon, soil, and welfare. If you have those indicators, you can see where you're getting those trade-offs, and you avoid those kind of trade-offs.
Thanks.
I think, in a way, I mean, our report on pig and poultry, it's so stark. We've got too much. And if we'd added dairy to the report, too much. There's too many animals. We've led people to believe that you can have meat 3 times a day, and that's fine. And the marketing and advertising tells you can do that. And you don't even need to cook it. All these kind of things. And I totally agree with what you're saying about trade and everything. But it feels like slightly tweaking at the edges, slightly more room for the chicken, slightly nicer conditions for the pig. Yeah, we should have those. But the reality is we need a food strategy and a land use strategy and environmental improvement plan which envisages a reduction in the concentration and numbers and delivers that for farmers as well as eaters and the supply chain in a way that works. And I know how difficult that is, but going forward, we can't afford to be using land to spread the mark if it's not used properly and to pollute the water. But more importantly, we don't need that amount of protein, that meat protein. We could have less and better meat. And less is a terrible word. I know it's all about growth. If I could think of a word that meant less but growing, I would. Somehow, we need to think that.
More and better.
Yeah, more and better. But the Eating Better did a poll that came out yesterday, and it showed how many people misunderstood how many people would be prepared to eat less. And 60% of people would be prepared to eat less, but people think it's only 40%. It just shows that perceptions, and it's an emotional issue. But I think we can carry on tweaking and making things a bit better. But at some point, we've got to grasp the nettle of it's too much and too concentrated, and mix the livestock back with the crops.
Okay, thanks. Did you want to come back with one question? And then I've got a question that I'm going to start with Martin for.
Just really quickly on that. So the government at the moment does produce guidelines on what we should eat for our own health. It could feasibly produce guidelines on what we should eat for planetary health.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that slide I put up, which came from the AHDB encouraging to eat meat, had a plate of meat that woman was apparently going to eat, which is a portion for a family, but it was on a single plate. That kind of messaging's got to change.
Yeah.
Okay, right, we're going to move on to a different topic now. And Martin, you and I talked about this briefly earlier. It's about responsibility. Someone's asked, whose responsibility is it to fund the transition to nature-friendly farming?
Well, that's a nice one. One, I think the economics for farming can lead to better outcomes if you move in that direction. If you focus on your soil health and the ecosystem around that underpins the production. So it's good for farm businesses, but there is a transition thing. There's a shifting away from a system where it was intensive focusing on inputs. So that's where the public support needs, as in a transition support, but also it's important for the supply chain to be on part of that, because you're producing a different standard of product that's focusing on environmental outcomes and business outcomes and soil health. Currently, we're feeling that my wheat from my regenerative farming is going into the same loaf of bread as an intensive wheat product, from anywhere in the world, because we're importing so much. So it's about how do we drive that thing. So we want the supply chain to step up, which they're starting to pay me to do regenerative actions in focusing on better systems. We want some public money to fund that transition, to de-risk that transition, because if you're stopping using insecticides and you've been addicted to them, your system needs to build up that resilience. So there's a bit of risk in transition. So then we focus on the true outcomes we want with public money that underpin food security of soil health and ecosystem services that underpin that. And that's where it's not subsidising, it's actually enhancing our landscape that allows those products to be produced at scale that we need. And it's that balance of funding. But we need it clearly laid out. And the farmers need to know where to invest. They're currently invested in the model that we've had, and they're getting pretty concerned that the model is shifting, but they've got stranded assets of what they invested in the past and they were going to pay for in the future. So how do we help them? And if we want them to stop having industrialised chicken sheds and everything else, do we pay for their debt? Because they've got to pay for that. It's what they were told to do 5 years ago. So how do we handle that stranded asset that if we want to accelerate this, we stick the right model in place that we can do it at scale and at pace. We could do a lot in 5 to 10 years if the will was there and that supply chain, the government and the funding accelerated that. And the amazing landscapes we could deliver in 5 to 10 years through our farming practices.
Thanks. Who wants to come next? Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with everything Martin said there, but I think we just emphasise the point. When we were looking before the election, what would be the cost of delivering the Environmental Improvement Plan? We came up with a very similar figure to National Trust, RSPB, Wildlife Trust. We're both in the ballpark. It's around about £5–6 billion. We've only got about half of that in public expenditure allocated. And yet we've still got the same slogans, the same political ambitions now. I think it was belatedly, we did get all the environmental groups and all the farming groups saying we actually need to have that sum of money. But I think there was a little bit of a nervousness amongst environmental groups to actually ask for the money that's necessary. We shouldn't be shy about that. This is a fraction of what it costs to run the National Health Service, and yet it covers the whole country. So this is why I think we really need to be bold. And yes, the rest of the food chain should also be contributing, and ultimately this is going to have an impact in terms of consumer prices too. And that is perhaps an unpalatable truth, but it is the truth that those choices they also have to contribute.
Just pick up the NHS point, if I may. I mean, the NHS is effectively subsidising bad farming because of the health disbenefits of the terrible food that we're producing. So if you could take a longer-term view, we would be shifting money from NHS to farming to improve the product that farming can produce so that we eat in a more healthy way and so we have a long-term better diet and a long-term better health. But our political system is too short-term to apparently allow that kind of decision to be made.
Can I just say?
Yeah.
I would just change what you said then. It was what farmers are producing. It's what the food industry is demanding that farmers produce. And the food industry is incredibly extractive. So, in a way, I did a piece of work at Sustain, and they're doing some more work in this area, which is great, showing just where the food pound goes. And farmers get so little. And so many other players get money from it and get a bit of profit. Nobody makes a lot. But I absolutely agree with Andrew there. We've got to bite this bullet and think about what it's going to mean for the kind of food that we're going to get and the prices. But the reality is our food is still very cheap. It's rent, it's energy costs, it's wages, it's precarity, etc. that are really big problems which this government should be grasping. But I think absolutely right about the trade as well. We need core trade standards so our farmers aren't competing. Can I just give a plug for Andrew George's early day motion? He's got an early day motion asking for action on supply chain fairness. And we need MPs from all parties. So if you know your MP, if you want to write to your MP, please do look up Andrew George, EDM, supply chain fairness. And it's about getting those regulations so that those bullies are still there. They are really bullying. And I'm not just talking about the retailers. We've got to stamp that out.
Okay, thanks, Vicky. So, Andrew, you talked about confidence in farming, and we've had a question on that. If confidence in farming is at an all-time low, is this not precisely when change is most likely to happen? If the existing system isn't working, will progressive farmers not make breakthroughs? What do you think to that? So if the existing system isn't working, will progressive farmers be the ones to break through and start to succeed in the system that we have?
It's the instinct of farm businesses to innovate and find ways through. I think that the difference now in England, and I think this is the interesting that's happened over the last 10 years since Brexit, we had a common agricultural policy, we've now got 4 different policies across the UK. English farmers are uniquely exposed now. David said 50% funding. In actual fact, in December, no farm business will get more than £7,500 into what was equivalent to direct support. That's forcing farmers to look at different choices. Yeah. And in that context, the environmental opportunity is staring them in the face. Is this going to contribute to the bottom line? And this is forcing farmers to look at it. And I've seen amongst the NFU members, some have gone and taken this as a great opportunity to innovate and really focus on their marketplace and get direct sales. And I think we heard that this morning. But most farms are commodity producers. When you've got tons of wheat, it isn't very difficult. It's quite difficult to convert that into a product that somebody in Bristol's going to buy. And so we've got to find ways that actually every farm can participate in that innovative approach. And I have to say that the removal of agricultural property relief, which I think David again sort of says this is going to inspire people to move on. It's also been a huge drain on confidence again. Families who've been planning on that type of succession overnight are going to have to change. Again, so it's going to force change, but it's very unpredictable. I think that's the worry about it. And I think if we're going to see a managed change that's going to deliver environmental sustainability across that 75% of the land space, it needs to be planned, not hap chance.
Martin?
I just want to add the difference across the UK. Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland have still got the similar kind of payment structure kind of thing. Yes, the asks are slightly different, but they've got guaranteed money coming across the door. In England, they've moved away from the subsidy to minimum payments. But they want to shut. We're all told to plan your business for public money for public goods. Many of us have gone and done that, and they're going to shut the door on us or not made it so we can get into that and get that. So what we're told to go and do, and then we've had a really couple of years of weather really challenging us in what our production is. And this year, as an arable farmer, the price of grain is on the floor. I'm selling wheat less than what was 20 years ago. My costs weren't the same as 20 years ago. We've lost most of the payments. The yields were down because of weather. And I think for the confidence of many farmers at the moment is, what the heck do I do when I've got bills to pay, I've got no sign of money coming in, you've sold your grain to pay your rent. How do we have the confidence? And we've got to get government and the supply chain really drive, what do we want from our farm landscape and our farmers, so we can have some confidence in investing. Because at the moment, I think we're in a real tricky situation. Many farmers may pack up, they may not intensify, but focus on things they will get money for. And that may not be the environmental outcomes we want. It'll be other things. And it's like, if they're going to pack up, who's buying the land? Because if you're not making any money, you can't afford to buy land when you're making about 1.5% on return on investment. And if I borrow the money, that's 4 to 5% interest rates. As farmers, you can't do it. So it's the companies and the bigger things. And we'll end up with bigger industries, not small farms, small businesses delivering local things. It's going to grow the size. So I think we're in that really tricky thing. And it's about all of us trying to help farmers have the confidence to go forward and clearly articulate what do we want from our farm landscape. That social license from farmers of what do we want. Stop causing as much harm and deliver these outcomes and give the confidence from government, supply chains and society to get there. We can do it, but we just need that confidence.
Yeah.
Can I go back to my first slide and my last slide, nearly? The first slide about farm incomes. Remember this, the farmers are losing money. Cereal farmers in East Anglia lose money on their farming. That is more or less offset at the moment by subsidies, but they're blanket subsidies paid per hectare across the board, regardless of what you do, and they make money in other ways. The shift from that to SFI or whatever it is, if it happens, and it has to happen, and it has to happen in a really focused way, is a real opportunity to change practices because the economics are so vulnerable. So that is a real possibility. And I also, just to go back to the inheritance tax thing, can I just illustrate that? There's a family near me, and this is, I know several families in this position, where John and Mary, I'll call them John and Mary, are in their 50s. They are doing the farming, but the farm is owned by John's parents. John and Mary wanted to do agroforestry. They've been wanting to do it for 10 years, but Granddad, who's not near the farm, not farming, blocks it. We don't do agroforestry on our farm. In the last 6 months, they have effectively transferred half the farm to John and Mary. John and Mary can now make the decisions, and they're going to plant agroforestry. That is the opportunity that is coming from that succession planning. There are families across the country, in farming families, who are having conversations about succession planning and about management of change, which were just effectively forbidden before. I know that's not the intention of the tax, but it's been an absolute opportunity.
Okay. A nice positive spin there. So we've got 2 minutes left, and I'm just going to ask the whole panel for a very quick answer to this question. What is your top ask for the new Secretary of State and farming ministers in their first weeks in DEFRA? And I want you to really, keep it to one. Who wants to go first? Go on, Martin.
Articulate a clear vision of what Labour Party and the government want us to do as farming and unlock the funding to allow that to happen.
Great.
I know. What we said to new Secretary of State was exactly that. We wanted a clear ambition for farming to deliver, and SFI are going to be critical.
Well, as they've said it, I would totally agree with what they say. So
you can agree with what's come before, but you can also say something different.
And they should do it really fast. I mean, it's 5 years since the Act was signed. That it was a revolutionary act to deliver these new schemes to support farmers in this way. So it's completely unacceptable that they're still waiting, and it's totally unacceptable. But let's have a food strategy and land use framework that really fits this new vision. And so that was more than one thing, but bringing it all together within a vision is critical.
Okay.
I would agree with that. I think just to slightly build on it, you probably hear a lot of talk about how we offshore environmental harm through our food consumption in this country. With regards to organic food, we tend to offshore the environmental benefits, and that's because we import most of the organic food that we eat in this country. So scaling up organic food in this country would bring considerable benefits. It's one of the best ways of reconciling food production with biodiversity gains, and that's going to be crucial to meet the 2030 biodiversity target, especially in lowland areas where we're really struggling to reverse those declines. So we want to see the new cohort of ministers pick up where the last cohort left off and finalise the organic action plan.
Great. David?
So the similar question was asked to the last panel, and one of the panel's answers was the government has to repair the relationship with farmers. Now, I don't disagree with that, but the relationship with farmers has to be one that doesn't simply roll in to the as it were, the worst case kind of farming or the undifferentiated kind of farming. It has to recognise that there's, as Martin said earlier on, good, bad and indifferent. The relationship with farming has to encourage the good and discourage the bad, not simply say we carry on with the terrible or the worst case wins. It can't be a rush to the bottom, and so repairing the relationship with farmers has to be a positive relationship that makes farming part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Great. Okay, we're out of time, so can I just everyone give a big round of applause to the panel, please? Thank you.